Well, hello again, folks. Today we move into chapter 9 of 2 Corinthians. And Paul really carries on here, encouraging these believers in Corinth to be ready to give money to the collection for the poor in Jerusalem. The first few verses here are pretty self-explanatory, really. Paul is urging them to be prepared to give. So he's sending people to collect the money. And if the Corinthians aren't ready, then it might feel like a bit of a chore for them to give all of a sudden. They might end up doing it begrudgingly. Also, Paul has been kind of telling everyone around the place how generous the church in Corinth is. And so I suppose he doesn't want this awkward scenario where people assume that this isn't the case, all because the Corinthians really were caught off guard and were unprepared. Because you see, Paul knows their hearts and he knows that they want to give to this very important cause. It's not the case that Paul's sort of saying all this to try and guilt trip them into doing it. Absolutely not. He knows they're willing. He knows their track record on giving, and he knows the attitude that already exists in that congregation. So he wants to give them every chance to give as they would like. And so in the rest of chapter 9, really, Paul just simply encourages them to give. He points out kind of the vast benefits of their giving. And he makes clear in verses 6 and 7 that God loves a cheerful giver. And folks, that is a vitally important principle when it comes to giving. Paul had already touched on this idea in chapter 8. He's spelling it out clearly here. When Christians give money to the church or to the poor or whatever, we should never do it begrudgingly. We should always do it with a smile on our face. The Lord does not want our money if it comes with kind of reluctance. It's never a contest to see who can give the most. It's never a challenge to see how spiritual we are. You know, if you give 10 grand, then you must be really godly. Absolute nonsense, not at all. And in order to make sure of this, Paul gives some really good practical advice. He says, be generous, yes, by all means, but only give whatever you've decided in your heart. And remember, he's already told them in chapter 8 that they should give according to their income. So really, when we put all these kind of principles together, basically what Paul is saying is think carefully about what you can give. Think carefully about what the Lord has given you, how much money you have coming into your household, what expenses you've got, and then figure it out. Figure out how can you be generous? How much money can you set aside happily, that's the key thing, happily, so that you can give generously to those who truly need it. That's the attitude that Christians should have when it comes to giving. There's no storing up money for ourselves, but there's also no burden being placed on Christian people to give absolutely everything, and so therefore leave nothing for themselves, live life on a shoestring budget. But Paul does make it clear, generosity is a wonderful thing. There are seasons in life too when God can be abundantly good to his children, giving more than enough. Perhaps in those seasons we ought to be willing to pass some of that along to help those who need it, willing to share God's abundant goodness with others. And in verse 12, Paul points out that the money being given goes a long, long way, not only in helping meet the needs of people who really do desperately need it, but also resulting in praise and thanksgiving for the Lord. And you see, the simple truth is there are costs to ministry. There are costs to sharing the gospel. Missionaries and ministers and whatever else, they need to live, they need to eat. And so as these Corinthians give, the poor are being helped, yes, and the apostles are being helped so they can keep reaching more and more people with the gospel. And both ways, the Lord's work abounds and the Lord's name is glorified. What a challenge this is for us today, folks, to be generous with what we have, to be willing to share what God has given us. Perhaps we all need to look out for opportunities to give and to help people who really do need it. On that note, we finish with chapter 9 here. Join us tomorrow then as we look at chapter 10. Until then, as ever, God bless.